Hi, in this video we're going to talk about The Singularity is Here by Ayad Akhtar. And I was really intrigued by what you posted last week on the discussion board. I asked you to select a golden line, a line that you think is particularly challenging or interesting, or just a line that resonated with you. And it seems like a lot of students were really intrigued or related to that line about how the time between looking at our cell phone is getting shorter and shorter. And it might not be just out of boredom, but it might be that we have some sort of discomfort or inability to sit with any sort of discomfort and anxiety. So we just sort of go to our phones on autopilot. So a lot of you picked up on that line. And there were several other lines that people chose that were really compelling. So thank you so much. In this video, I'm going to show you some of my annotations and some of my notes on the article. This is going to be a very informal conversation about the article. To give our conversation a little bit more structure, to kind of think about some big points you want to look at whenever you're analyzing an article, there are a few points on this Canvas page. So you want to think about the rhetorical situation. And this is very similar to what you would include in a rhetorical précis, which we do a lot for homework, right? That 4-sentence, really tightly written paragraph that goes a little bit beyond summary. So things like the writer, the message, the audience or the intended audience, the purpose, the moment, the medium. So in this case, Akhtar is writing in the Atlantic magazine. It's not an article that we can skim through or kind of read while we're half awake on our phones. It's an article that really requires that we're awake, that we're taking notes, that we're even looking up references. And the version that I'm using is the one that comes from ProQuest on the Pierce Library databases. So the version I'm using is very boring. You can also access it unless you've used up all your free articles on the Atlantic website. But of course that has really cool images, but it also has things like ads, which can be distracting. I'm going to use the boring version from the Pierce Library databases. I think the moment is also interesting. So this article is very recent. It was published in December of 2021. I think this particular moment in time, a moment when a lot of us are still looking at screens a lot, and we have been even pre-pandemic, makes this article particularly relevant. And you might also think as you're reading about just the audience, who's the intended audience? There are so many references to other ideas about artificial intelligence. Even the title is a reference to a book. I had to look this up, I didn't know, but a book called The Singularity is Near. And here he's saying the singularity is here, it's already happened. We'll talk about what I think he means by the singularity a little bit later. You also want to look at how the argument develops. So not just the thesis or the main idea, but how the argument evolves and develops. In my reading of the essay, he starts by talking about predictive advertising technology. And he talks about how it's actually shaping the way that we think and remaking us. And that way it reminded me of a little bit of Nicholas Carr's article. If you've been in my 101 class, you've read it. His article was called Is Google Making Us Stupid? Different argument, right? He's talking about something a little bit different, but he argues that Google is actually changing the way that we think. And here the argument is that the ads are actually changing our cognition, changing even our personalities. Then kind of toward the middle of the essay, he talks about how this type of advertising is feeding us things that are especially things that make us feel a certain emotion, in particular outrage. This works really well, and these advertisers or these companies or these platforms are aware of it. And he also talks about how these platforms, whether it's HBO or Netflix or YouTube or Instagram, whatever it is, they want hours a day of us looking at these platforms or engaging with the platforms, because the more hours a day we spend, the more information they can gather about us, right? The more patterns about us they have, and then they can monetize that, right? They can advertise to us, or they can sell that information to other companies. Then he starts talking a little bit about how this kind of obsession with screens, but also how what we're fed back to us is sort of mirroring what we already think, is making us very narcissistic. It's making us turn inwards and think that we must be right because we're fed information that confirms what we already believe. And then he ends the article with a discussion of writing, and he references several famous authors. And I want you to think about why that might be and why he ends this with so many important authors. What rhetorical appeals does the writer use? And then also we'll talk a little bit about style, things like sentence types, figurative language. I think sometimes when we're reading an article, we tend to not unpack those elements. But I think this article in particular, and so many of the articles that we'll read, there's so much rich language. So we'll talk about style. Figurative language, that's not exactly style, but I put it in the same category. So let's take a look at the actual article. The singularity is here. Like I said, I'm showing you just my annotations, very informal. Some of my annotations are just notes that I have for myself. You can do this too. You can put documents into Google Docs, or you can actually print it out if you want. But this is the type of article that you want to be annotating. We are not writing a rhetorical analysis of this essay at this point in the semester. For your first essay, you're writing a rhetorical analysis of an image, but later in the semester, you will be required to write a rhetorical analysis essay of an article. So the more you annotate an article, the easier it becomes to pull out what strategies, what techniques the writer is using, or in other words, how the writer is making their argument and to what extent it's effective. So I talked a little bit about the overview of the argument at the beginning of the video. One thing I noticed kind of on the side here is that he's using very intimate examples. So in this paragraph, I think it's about paragraph 3 or 4 or so, it says, our movements in space, our breathing at night, our expenditures and viewing habits, our internet searches, our conversations in the kitchen and in the bedroom. All of it is observed by no one in particular. All of it reduced to data parsed for the patterns that will predict our purchases. I really love that line. I thought that was really powerful for several reasons. One, so many of these examples, like the kitchen, your breathing at night, what you buy, your internet searches, they're very intimate, and it's being observed, but not by a single guy behind a computer, but by no one in particular, which is simultaneously less scary, but also maybe a little bit more frightening. And it's being reduced to data that can be used to predict our purchases, right? They're looking for patterns. I noticed alliteration, parsed for the patterns that will predict our purchases. And I always think it's helpful to think about why writers might make certain choices. Maybe he's just using alliteration there, that repetition of that P sound to make it sound kind of punchy, but I think it makes it more memorable, certainly, to punctuate it with those P's. But it also kind of has this sort of methodical kind of pattern to it with the alliteration, which kind of mimics what he's talking about there. So I love those moments where form mirrors content. Maybe it's intentional, maybe not, but I really loved that line. So he's talking here about how it's not just predictive. This type of advertising or technology, it really goes beyond advertising, isn't just predictive, that it actually influences us. It actually changes us. And like I said, I wrote a little note about this reminding me of Nicholas Carr's article. Here he talks about emotion and how things that are cute or sweet, in other words, you might think of appeal to pathos, which we talked about a couple of classes ago, how advertisers know that those things keep us logging in or looking at something, and in particular, outrage. He talks about that a little bit later in the paper. I thought this example of the Reno divorce lawyer in Reno is particularly depressing. Obviously talking about something very intimate like divorce, but how it's monetized and how actually some of these words become quite expensive. The example of mesothelioma was particularly interesting there, and I think kind of depressing and sort of cynical too. I also thought here the technology is self-regulating by nature. It evolves like a virus needing a healthy sampling of the population in order to spawn variations. For the tech to be able to tailor and deliver advertising in its various forms, it needs eyeballs. So this, I think, really captures the moment. Obviously, we're all aware of viruses, given what we experienced during the pandemic. So the virus comparison was particularly apt. But I noticed throughout the essay, there's a lot of references to body parts that are sort of disembodied, right? That they're almost described as if they're not attached to a human. Eyeballs, not a person looking, but eyeballs. Later he talks about fingers doing something, not a person working the fingers, but just fingers, as if they're existing on their own. I thought that was really effective. It's subtle, but I noticed that kind of throughout the whole piece. So why does more time equal more, or why is more time important to companies like HBO or whatever it is? Here he uses the HBO example. It's because the more time we spend looking at something, the more information they have about us and our preferences, and that can be turned into. So one of my golden lines comes in this paragraph. And it says, driven by the engagement and the profit that it generates, each side drifts further and further from the other. The space between us growing only more charged, only richer with opportunity for monetization. The cultural clash in America today has more to do with electrical engineering than we realize. Thought that was really stunning. So the fact that we are so divided as a country perhaps has more to do with these algorithms and with companies who use this information to feed our emotional responses based on what they know that we like and based on our preferences. But this has more to do with that than actual anger at one side or the other. That it actually has to do with electrical engineering and the algorithm more than humans themselves. I also thought the examples that were used were particularly compelling. So examples like the slaughter of the Rohingya, and also examples having to do with Republicans versus Democrats. I think you all know what he's talking about here, right? When you watch a video on YouTube, and the more you watch on YouTube, the more that it knows what kinds of videos you'll like to see later, and that it shapes our responses in real time. So as we go, the way we're feeling about something, that is shaped in real time. Pretty shocking when you kind of think about it. Another line that I pulled out comes a little bit later, and I noticed here that the sentence structure kind of parallels the idea or the argument that he's making in the sentence. I love those moments when form and content really go hand in hand. The synergy of data technology, computer processing speeds and capacity, and an almost frictionless interconnectivity, all of this enables exchange, delivery of services, production of goods, growth of capital, and most centrally, the endless catalog of our every interface, however glancing, however indirect, with a system sprawling and ubiquitous apparatus. The singularity is here. We could call it the era of automation, and its inescapable imprint on our inner lives is already apparent. So I thought that sentence where he lists off all those things, delivery of services, and punctuates it with semicolons. There's all these lists of all of these interconnected things that go really quickly. And then he kind of interrupts himself with however glancing, however indirect. I thought that mirrors exactly what he's talking about, our experience being on these platforms. So I loved that moment. And of course, we get to the title of the essay here too. I also noticed a lot of references, like I said earlier, to kind of disembodied body parts or even comparing people to rats. So lots of language that dehumanizes people. And I think he's making a point there, right? That this is turning us into some sort of automaton, that we're not really coming up with our own preferences necessarily. They're being shaped by something else. This was a section, the yellow part right here, where I had to go back and read it a couple of times. It was really dense. And when I come across a line that I think is really dense, I try to not run away from it or gloss over it. I try to go back and really figure out what it's saying. So the fetishizing modality of the human unconscious, until now ever elusive, is given ordinal form as the technology channels the nebulous pull of our proverbial id with Cartesian clarity, our deepest currents of desire rerouted toward the system's mercantile ends. Okay, let's break that down a little bit. So a fetish can be some sort of object that has particular spiritual significance, that people can sort of obsess over. It also, of course, has the sexual fetish connotation. And when something is made a fetish, oftentimes that thing is dehumanized or treated in kind of a stereotypical way, especially if we're talking about something human. And the reference to the id, if you've taken like a psychology class, or even if you haven't, you've probably heard of the id, the ego, the super ego, Freud's whole idea, is the unconscious, impulsive, kind of innate desire that we have, something that we have at birth, according to Freud. Of course, it's more complicated than this, but I'm kind of boiling it down and making it simple. And then the proverbial id, so proverbial means spoken about a lot or referenced a lot, with Cartesian clarity. That refers to Descartes, Rene Descartes. And this is really beyond my understanding because it's quite mathematical. But it refers to any sort of logical thinking and refers to analytical geometry. You can Google more of that if you want. Later in the piece, he mentioned syllogism, which I just want to talk about briefly since it's a word we've used in this class. Syllogism is something you learn about in a logic class or formal logic class. The idea is we go from a major premise to a minor premise to a conclusion. It's an example of deductive logic, moving from the general to the more specific. And the famous example is all men are mortals. Socrates is mortal, so Socrates must be mortal. So here he talks about the syllogism that we don't necessarily think about on a conscious level, but it's still there. Something is wrong if nothing is happening. Something is always happening on this screen, on our phones or whatever it is. And nothing is wrong when I'm on this screen. And a lot of you picked up on this line or a passage from this particular section of the piece because I think there's so much truth to it. And the tone here at the beginning of the paragraph really shifts from being more academic and cerebral earlier in the piece to now being kind of funny. How much time has passed by? Every 15 minutes? That was so 2018. We're in 2021. So it's a shift in tone, and I think the example is a compelling one. Can you think of any personal examples that would help to illustrate what he's saying here, that we feel on the one hand the sense of boredom, but it's also an inability to sit with any sort of feeling of discomfort? Because I know I can. I often just reach for the phone when I'm not really understanding why I'm doing it. This is where he starts to get into narcissism. So when he references Ovid, I think that's a reference to the Greek myth of Narcissus, who was so obsessed with his own image that he died as a result of staring at himself in the lake. And of course, that's where the term narcissism or narcissist comes from. So he gets into how constantly being fed or refed our own viewpoints is making us more self-absorbed than we were. Obviously, we've always been self-absorbed, but this is making it even worse. And in this passage that I've highlighted, you can see how he tries to argue that point, and how self-marketing, self-promotion, even suggesting that spending time online can be a form of activism, actually is about hours a day that we're looking at our phones and companies can make more money. Something really cynical and sad about that, if that's true, if you buy that argument, that it's actually all about making money and not necessarily about activism or self-esteem or gaining a sense of self or a pleasure that leads to something greater, that ultimately it's just something as basic as money. I think the image that he paints in this paragraph, or the simile, that we are little more than grist for the monetizing mill that mixes like cattle feed ground from cattle bones, our own deepest intimacies with the system's digital slop, feeding it back to us wholesale. That's so visceral and disgusting, but I think it really sticks in our minds. Cattle is an interesting choice here because when we think of cattle, we think of something that's going to be slaughtered. We think of something that's going to be consumed. And of course, we also think of herd mentality, which he talks about later in this essay. So it's almost like we're cannibalizing our own trash or our own refuse. That's what this really vivid and grotesque comparison is doing, and it's being sold back to us. Here's where I think he really establishes his credibility by referencing all sorts of famous writers like Philip Roth, to F. Scott Fitzgerald, to Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. He's establishing his credibility, and he's talking a lot about writing and art here. At first, I didn't understand why until I realized and I looked up that he is a pretty famous playwright who has written all sorts of plays and won many awards. So this quotation is one that I would recommend that you read, but this video is getting long, so we're going to scoot to the bottom here. So he continues to talk about narcissism and kind of this obsession with the self because of this predictive technology. And he also gets at the so what. Why does this matter that we aren't necessarily making our own choices, that we're being fed something based on our previous choices. Why does that matter? Well, he seems to suggest here that certainty, knowing we're right, being certain that we are right and the other guy is wrong, or the other gal is wrong, is the enemy of good writing. It's the enemy of art. It's the enemy of good thinking, public discourse, political conversation, and maybe even like interpersonal relationships like friendship. Now, you might not buy all of this, right? You don't necessarily have to agree with the argument. We're just trying to analyze what he's saying and talk about how the different parts work together at this point. He defines affinities, which is sort of more complex than I thought it was, so you might want to go back and review what exactly he says about the word affinity and how he means it. And I'd like you to think about what's left out of this essay. I think this essay is really effective and really powerful and comes at a really important moment. But what is left out of this essay? Are there a lot of personal examples? Are there a lot of scientific studies about our neurochemistry? Are there a lot of kind of hypothetical examples, or not really? So when you're analyzing something, sometimes thinking about what's left out can be really effective too. I don't think I defined the singularity. He references what he means by the singularity earlier in the essay. He means the point in time when AI, or artificial intelligence, will eclipse human intelligence and it can't really be reversed. And he is referring back to other thinkers who have discussed the singularity in a similar way. So I hope you enjoyed this article. I know it's challenging, but I would go back and read it a couple of times before you take the quiz. Okay, talk to you soon.